Well, welcome everybody. So glad you're all here. Welcome to the Seed to Submission Practical Grant Writing Workshop for Care Farmers. This is going to be recorded, so we're going to jump right in, and everyone will receive a recording within the week. Today's webinar is one of the most talked about sessions from our most recent conference. And we're hoping that you find a lot of really practical, down to earth help from our presenter, Kara McCall. As I said, we received such great feedback on this breakout session back at the conference. And we're going to have some time for Q&A at the end, maybe about 10 minutes of that. So just a quick note that you are going to be muted during this presentation, but feel free to drop in any questions in the chat as you go. I will be monitoring that and can bring those to Kara if they're time sensitive. Otherwise, we'll have time at the end for Q&A. So with that, Kara, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks. Hi, everyone. As Kate said, my name's Kara McCall. I'm the executive director at Red Wiggler. Care Farming Network is a program of Red Wiggler. And I have been involved Red Wiggler in various capacities over the last 16 or so years, 17 years now, I guess, and writing grants for almost that whole time, both for Red Wiggler and other organizations. I am by no means an expert in grant writing, but I do have a lot of experience specifically in writing grants for care farms. So my hope today is to give an overview of the process. This is what we'll cover today. You know, talking about what funders want, what the elements of a grant are, and then we'll also talk about leveraging AI as part of this process. I'm also not an expert in AI, but I have found it very, very useful. And I will preface it, and I will probably say this a couple of times to drive home my discomfort with AI in general. And also, it really has been a very valuable tool that I think it's important for all of us sort of doing the good work to know how to use it well. So we'll jump right in here and start by talking about what funders want to see. So I, as part of being an executive director and writing grants in general, I'm talking with lots of funders, and these are some of the things that come up as what people sometimes miss in writing grants and even writing appeals. There's sort of four elements, three that are on your side of the house. So making sure that you're identifying a clear problem, right? If there's no problem that we're trying to solve, then there's nothing to be funded. And so it's important to show that there's actually a problem that whatever your care farm is providing solves. So is that unemployment rates? Is that mental health? Is that inadequate treatment for substance use disorder? Whatever that problem is, make sure you identify it. And we'll go into a little bit more detail later on, but identify it with statistics when you can, with examples. And then you need to be able to describe what the credible solution is that you are providing, right? So there's a problem, and then here's the solution that you are either currently doing or proposing to do at your care farm. These are the details about your programming. And then they also want to see evidence that you can execute. So if you're an existing care farm or you've done work like this in the past, showing examples of what that is, that you've done things like this before. If you're brand new, then showing examples of other care farms or similar organizations that have done it to kind of prove that it is a good solution. Also showing things like you have good financial controls, right? No one wants to give money to an organization that isn't responsible with their money. So making sure that you're talking about your financial protocols, your board involvement if you're a nonprofit, what your cash reserves are, things like that. And I'm going to assume for the most part that if you're here for a grant writing workshop, you are a nonprofit because that's who's mostly eligible. So we will be talking mostly in nonprofit terms, though there are grants for small businesses, certainly, that this is all applicable to as well. And then finally, so that's what you're offering, right? That's what you can do, identifying the problem, identifying the solution that you're offering, the evidence that you can execute, and then making sure you're aligning to their priorities. And this is where language can become really important. Make sure you're looking at their website, you're looking at their request for proposal, their questions, and as much as possible, using the language or mirroring the language that they have and identifying very clearly what priority of theirs that you're meeting. Um, Sometimes this gets a little tricky, especially when an organization or a funder is using maybe outdated language. As an example, in the disability world, there is one funder that still uses the term mental retardation in their RFP. You need to decide whether you're going to use that language or not. In that case, I choose to use intellectual and developmental disabilities. But when I first say it, I will put in parentheses mental retardation as to make sure that they are connecting the dots, and then I'm using the IDD throughout. Um, there's many more easier examples that it's just easy to lift and shift your language to match theirs. Um, that's sort of on the surface level of just making sure that you are using the language that is most familiar to them, but it's also the actual priorities, right? A great thing to do is look at Funders 990, look at who they have funded in the past, and if you can, reach out to those organizations to see what they were funded for, what is most appealing to them. If you can talk to a program officer at the foundation or funder, that's helpful as well. Really making sure that whatever you are applying for is very specific to their priorities. Okay, so hopping into the elements of a grant. Now, every grant proposal, unfortunately, is different. There is not a perfect, you can't just write a base grant and say, there we go, I'm just going to use this and apply with the same thing over and over again. These are the elements that are generally found within a grant. So the first is a clear program focus. You want to make sure that you're understanding whether they are going to fund general operating, which generally means unrestricted funds for whatever it is that your organization does, that it doesn't need to be program specific. Others are program specific, where it's going to be very much. Great example at Red Wiggler is that we are sometimes writing grants specifically for Care Farming Network program and sometimes specifically for the farm program, sometimes drilled even further, right? Sometimes we're writing grants for the mentorship program of CFN. So really understanding whether this funder is doing general operating or program specific. Even if they say they do both, looking at their 990, talking with people that they've funded to see what they're more likely to fund can be really helpful. And then the third top of the top three is capital. So things like capital improvements, infrastructure. So really understanding, making sure you're clear on what you're asking for and whether it's general operating, program specific, or capital. And then within that are making sure that you know what you are looking for money for. So is it for people? Is it for production, the infrastructure and equipment? Is it for access? Is it, you are looking to fund to cover the cost of food distribution to underserved communities? Are you looking to provide access to education on your farm? And so you want to make sure that you have a clear program focus. It can be all three of these, just making sure that when you are writing the grant, at the end of it, they know what they are funding. You then need to make sure that you define the need. So these are some examples of how to do that. You want to, this goes back to the first slide, but you want to make sure you're identifying who benefits from it. So what is the problem you're solving, and who is the beneficiary? Give context to that. So, why Is it that in Maryland, in your home state, is it that it's a certain population nationwide? Who are the beneficiaries of the work you're doing, and what are the circumstances that your care farm finds themselves in to be able to meet that need? At least one strong data point. And I think a really important question to make sure you're answering is what would happen without your farm? So if your program didn't exist, what wouldn't happen, right? It's really easy for us to talk about all of the wonderful things, but I think it's really powerful to be able to tell a funder if we don't do this, then these X amount of people don't have access to whatever it is, don't have access to therapy, don't have access to food, don't have access to employment, and what that means to them. So, whether that's explicitly saying without our farm, this would happen, or just calling attention to what the current situation is. So here's an example that we've used. According to Maryland Works, the unemployment rate for people with disabilities was about twice that of those with no disability in 2024. So that's that one strong data point. It's identifying who the beneficiary is and giving context in the place. In terms of the approach, this is your approach. What is the approach that you're taking to the work to solve the problem? You want to really work on painting the picture here. So, what does that day-to-day reality look like? One of my favorite things to describe in grants is what our morning meeting looks like, because I think it really explains, it paints the picture, it shows the funder what a day, how the day starts off, who's there, what they're doing, what they're learning, what they're engaging in. Explaining why your model works for your population, right? So I think sometimes, and I had this and still sometimes fall into this trap because I believe it, that care farming solves so many problems, and it's easy to just make these sort of big blanket statements, but to make it really impactful and appealing to the funder, explaining why you're doing it the way you're doing for the people you're doing it with in the place you're doing. Adding quotes from participants. So here's one that we use often. A great way to get some of these quotes is to just use them from news articles that have been written about you. So get media and then incorporate that in, because usually when I use this quote, I'll say like from an interview with Bittersweet. So that also adds some legitimacy to your organization. And then you're going to want to talk about the staffing, talk about the workflows, the standard operating procedures, the SOPs that you use, and what your program design is. So sometimes in a grant, this will be called the activities. And the reason I sort of pulled it out as the approach is I think sometimes it's easy to get sort of too specific, either too broad or too specific in the activities. So to make sure that you're really painting the full picture of what your approach. And because care farming is a less known term than some others, this is also where adding in information about just defining care farms. So I see the question in here. If you're trying to establish a care farm, what kind of quote would I suggest? I think this is a great place to talk about the need. So if you've identified partners for the population or people within the population that you're working in, using a quote that explains what's missing from their experience, to really drive home the need for your work. I could also see using quotes from other care farms. So, that's something that's why we exist as the Care Farming Network, is to be able to share resources. Talking with other care farms and saying, hey, do you have a quote from a participant or, a staff member that really talks about why care farming is important to them or impactful for them? And then we have our goals and outcomes. Now, this a little bit of a broken record in that, every grant is different, and you really do need to pay attention to how they define all of these terms, because sometimes you'll hear SMART goals, and they're talking about goals. But this is helpful for me, and this is the framework that I use when I'm doing program design and program development. And that's something, ideally you're going into a grant writing experience with the program already defined. You're not making a program up as you're writing the grant to fit the grant need. That can really open you up for danger of mission creep or overextending yourself. And so, if you are just starting to establish your programs or you're looking to revamp your programs, these are the definitions of and how I like to track impact. So goals are like the lofty ones, right? The overarching, they're generally not specific enough to measure. So this could be something like care farming improves the quality of life for my participants. And then the objectives is really when we get into that SMART, the specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. And it's what contributes towards reaching that goal. Your outcomes are then the behavior, right? The changes in attitudes or perceptions or skills that result from your project. And then the outputs are the numbers, just the straight, tangible, X amount of participants, 10 workshops, 5 days a week, right? Those just like numbers that are important. Alone, though, they don't tell a story, right? They don't tell the impact. They show the number of people, the number of touches, things like that. But if you, and I will be very honest that we have fallen into this quite often because outputs are easiest, right? Counting, tallying, and they are important. They show the breadth of your work often, and that is very valuable. But without being able to prove the change in the people, and I'm seeing right now a lot more focus from funders on like what's the actual change we're seeing in people, not just the number of people, right? But what's the actual change we're seeing, and how are you measuring that, and how are you sustaining that over time? Okay, great. Um, More on goals and outcomes, just the difference between quantitative and qualitative. So quantitative are quantitative, right? Numbers, qualitative, and they can really help, like I talked about, showing the participation, showing the outputs. Qualitative is what can make those connections and build confidence in what you're doing, and also can measure those things, right? So some examples are 87% of educational group tours were led by growers. That alone is great. 87% sounds great, but this is the don't forget the so what. So what? What is the big deal about that? So then the example is 75% of them then reported that they learned something new from working with a grower. We could then go further to say, and what I do say is, this is then breaking down the stereotypes of working with people with disabilities, right? So making sure you have a mix of quantitative and qualitative outputs and outcomes, and really not forgetting to ask yourself when you put something in here, so what? Why would someone care about this, and what difference is it making? There's generally, not always, but generally, especially for larger grant amounts or larger funders, explaining the organizational readiness. So this is back to that explaining, why they should trust you with their money, essentially, right? This gets into why are you the org to do it? Why not the farm next door, or the other organization? Proving your track record. So if you are established, showing that saying how many years you've been doing the work. If you are brand new, talking about the history of care farming and the track record of care farming generally. Huge focus right now on partnerships. Almost every grant that I'm writing has a question about who are your partners. A lot of push to co-write grants, and if not, actually do the grant writing together to really show that nonprofits are sharing resources. Funders want to see that I find it a little unfair. It's like here, these organizations that are already doing so much with little, do it, stretch it a little bit further. And I get the point. They want to make sure that resources are being allocated well. And so partnerships are a really big part of that. And also showing that you have systems in place that whether those systems are around finances or scheduling or making sure there's safety measures in place, whatever your systems are, incorporating that into this. And then, of course, showing financial stability and sustainability. If you don't have, if you're brand new or you have been in a period of deficit budgets, not meeting your budget each year, you can also just talk about the financial protocols that you have in place. Things like at Red Wiggler, any payment over $6,000 requires two signers. So it has to be me and it has to also be approved by a board member. Adding those things in just to show that your organization takes money seriously and is going to use their money appropriately and responsibly. So this is something, just a statement. And even if they don't ask for this, I would encourage if there's, I know word count and character count is always a thing, so you might not always have room. But something like this, the organization. So we'll use Red Wiggler. Red Wiggler has established SOPs to ensure financial oversight that enable consistent and effective program delivery. Not a great example because I don't know that financial oversight is program delivery, but you get the point. You can kind of plug and play some of these things. Then there's the actual ask. And this is something that I don't know how many times I'll finish a grant and be like, oh, I forgot to actually ask them for what we want, right? Even if there's like so many things are fillable, right? And you're putting in the amount in a little box, but making it clear, connecting what you're asking for with what you're doing in the body of the grant is also important so that they make that connection. One thing that I think is really easy to fall into, especially if you're writing lots of these, is forgetting that this person may have never heard of your organization and they aren't making all the connections you are, which we'll talk a little bit about proofreading later, but having someone read less so, I mean, grammar is important, making sure that you are, you have good language and all of that is important in a grant, but even more so, having someone that isn't super involved in your work read at least kind of some of your base language to say like, do you know what I mean when I say this? Because we start to get this inside lingo that I don't think we even realize we have it until someone says, what does that mean? And you're like, oh, I use that phrase every day. So when you're thinking about the ask, make sure you have an exact amount in mind. And a great way if they don't give you the amount that they are funding, back to that 990, look to see. I just worked with a fundraising consultant, and they said for sort of small to mid-sized foundations, generally family foundations, which is the bulk where the bulk of Red Wiggler's foundation funding comes from. When you're starting cold, an ask between $10,000 and $15,000 is usually a good sweet spot. It of course depends on your budget, but that's kind of a good spot to start. And make sure you're telling what the funds will be used for, when they're going to be used. Make sure your time frame meets the time frame of the grant. In part because if you are submitting this and your outcomes are going to be achieved before you even get the money, then that's going to be a little hard to explain why you needed it, right? So make sure that the time frame that you're talking about matches with the time frame of their funding. Reiterate who or what will benefit. The why now is something that I've just started using in part because um, there's a lot of reason why now is more important than other times. But bringing in the whatever the circumstances are surrounding the need that you're meeting, why now is important, why they shouldn't wait until their next grant cycle. Why you want to give them the reason not to put you in the like, oh, we'll consider them next year, right? Like, why do they need to fund you now? And then similarly, the context within the bigger picture. So if that's because there's been federal cuts to social services, whether that's because the need has grown larger in your community for one reason or the other, making sure you incorporate all of that. Um, just give folks a second to review this. And again, you'll get this deck, but being specific in your ask, making sure there's a clear program focus. And whether this is one statement, again, it depends on the grant proposal and the RFP. This may be peppered throughout, but making sure that you've named the expenses. Usually there's a budget that goes, a program budget, but if it's a general operating grant, there may not be an opportunity for you to say specifically what their money is going to be used for. Generally speaking, with general operating grants, and always read your grant agreements, this is not legal advice, but the if you're writing it for general operating, then there's not restrictions on what you're using it for, which sometimes I can get into the trap of then just being so broad and so overarching that I think it sometimes loses the meat and like why someone would get excited about funding. So I've started to be like more specific, like this grant will help pay for 3 full salaries of people with disabilities, just like whatever the amount equates to, even if that's not exactly, even if you're not going to be allocating that way. But again, make sure that you read the fine print because there are some grants that what you say in the grant is what has to be funded. And so making sure that you're clear on that. Um, and then words like support, and I have support our grower program, but then I get into specifics on the strong side. But just making sure that you are as specific and concrete as possible. And then talking a little bit more about the budget, really consider your budget part of your proposal, right? It's another way to paint the picture, especially for program and capital proposals. It's a way for you to highlight the different activities that you are undertaking that this funder would fund. Make sure it matches your narrative. If you talk about employment, make sure there's an employment line in your budget. Be clear and realistic, and then showing the funder value through how you're highlighting efficiency, especially if you have a way of grants narrative. An example that I just wrote with help of AI, which I will talk about in a minute, but that I just wrote about. I am asking for funding for a pilot program. And so then the question is, okay, well, how will you sustain it? And so what I wrote in the grants narrative is that the beauty of this is that it's being incorporated into our programming that already exists. So once the training portion is through, which is what I'm asking for funding for, it will be able to be continued on without additional funding. So there's sustainability within that. Another option is if you want to talk about sort of your diversified funding streams, if you have them, or how you are planning to diversify your funding streams. So that way, people know that funders know that you are really understanding the weight of their investment. This is also a great place to talk about any in-kind or matching contributions. It both bolsters the confidence that other people are already giving you money for this. And so people would be more likely to trust you with their money. And it also shows that there is sustainability there. And then making sure to keep it easy. Make sure that on all of your attachments, your name and the header of what it is on the physical document. I just made this mistake a couple of months ago. I was submitting it online and the file name had exactly it, right? It said Red Wiggler, it said FY26 budget versus actuals, but I did not put a title on the page and it got kicked back to me, even though they know, but they wanted to print it for their grant reviewers and they wouldn't see like this is the FY26 budget versus actual. So those little details really are very important. And just making sure that your budget and your overall attachments are really clean and easy to read. Um, so we know that care farming is very fundable. There's lots of great examples. And also there are some common issues around that I'm finding. Um, Care farms don't fit neatly into one category, right? We are ag, we're horticulture, we're social service, and we all have potentially different revenue streams that we can be going after. While this can be an issue, it's also a real opportunity. More often than not, a social service, sort of blanket social service opportunity applies to care farms. So you just need to you may need to separate out and change your angle and what you're emphasizing in the grant, depending on what the funder is most interested in. But the fact that we don't fit neatly into a funding category can at first seem like a barrier, but it really is an opportunity. And it is okay to shift your language and emphasize different things depending on who you're going after funding from. This is a problem not just for care farms, but oftentimes this idea of overhead and salaries are difficult to fund. And I don't know about all of you, but about between 60 and 80% of our budget is labor costs and salaries. So this is where just in your narrative, really talking about the therapeutic value of what your staff is providing, and what programming really means. Most funders understand this, and I have found in the last decade there is more acceptance in funding salaries, but something to, again, you may just have to find ways to really be clear on why you need the people you have with the specialties or the training or whatever it is that they have to be carrying out the services. Um, the term care farming isn't widely known, but we are fixing that. We are changing that. That's a big part of why we exist. And every time any one of us writes a grant or has a news article or does all these things and defines what care farming is, but the easy fix here is just right at the top, define what care farming is, talk about the fact that you're part of a almost 400 member care farming network that adds legitimacy to what you're doing. Um, and sometimes the impact, we know it's real, right? People are constantly telling me, I know what you do works because when I come to the farm, I see it, I feel it, I experience it. Well, what about all the people that aren't coming to your farm, right? How do you really drive home what the impact is? And that's where we get back to those goals, outcomes, objectives, and outputs. Really focusing on being able to quantify what your impact is. And I know I was a little down on outputs, but outputs alone are what funded Red Wiggler for at least the first 15 years of our existence. We didn't have, clear outcomes to show change other than the fact that we were putting money into people's pockets, which people can then, know what that means for people. But in terms of, what the actual impact, we did not really start talking about that in our fundraising until about halfway through our existence. So even if you just have outputs, that there is still impact in that, and so using that. Um, I'm going to keep plugging away because time's a ticking, but if you have questions, drop them in the chat and I will get to them at the end here. So a little bit of a pivot, though more of just a continuation, is talking about how we can leverage AI. I will say my disclaimer again, unless anyone here is new, because I do not want to give the impression that I am some AI enthusiast, although I will be fully transparent that it is a tool that I am using multiple times a day. I know that there's a lot of there's lots of feelings and lots of different ways of thinking about AI. I'm going to talk to you specifically about how I use it for grant writing and how I think it can really help you in your grant writing. So first, just a little bit about what is generative AI. AI is a category of software. It's not a single tool, right? So there's lots of different softwares out there that fall into this generative AI. It is learning patterns, not meaning. So it knows how to identify sequences and patterns and like things and putting like things and not like things and categorizing, but it cannot, at least not yet, derive meaning. It's really important to know that it can sound so confident even when it's wrong. I had something today, they call them hallucinations, where it just made up a citation. Andrea's smiling and shaking her head because she just had a real rough go with ChatGPT about a week ago, where it really just was making things up. So always check your sources. Do not take it at face value. It's trained on large amounts of existing text, and that's where it sometimes can get its wires crossed. It will mirror the language and norms that it has been exposed to. So what that means is the more you use it, the better it will get at sounding like you, like knowing what you want. You can actually ask the tool that you're using. I forget what the prompt is, but you can find it online to basically like tell me what you know about me. And that was really interesting because it spit back to me like you prefer strengths-based, not deficit-based language when you're writing, right? Things like that. It got most things right. It did think I lived somewhere else, but that's because things are confusing there. But it also will not necessarily challenge what your goal is unless you explicitly ask it to. It's going to try and fulfill it. And so even if it's a bad idea, it's not, unless you ask me, ask it, don't ask me, unless you ask it, tell me whether you think this is a good idea or not. If you just say, like, hey, this is my idea, it will literally tell you, that's a great idea. Let me help you fulfill that. So make sure that you're being clear, and I'll get into kind of some of the tips and tricks there. Um, these are three of many, 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 many bajillion AI tools. So it depends on what platform you have. I was a ChatGPT user until a few weeks ago. I've used Google Notebook LM a couple of times. It's great for research projects, and it can create infographics. I can hear all my artist friends being mad at me as I say that, though. It's not something I use it for very often, though on a small budget, it can generate some decent looking material. I have now switched to Claude as my main go-to chatbot. I find the formatting better. What I really like about Claude is that there's a little bit more inquiry that it gives. So ChatGPT has a tendency, in my experience, to just kind of give it all, give you a whole bunch of stuff without asking clarifying questions. And Claude actually has like a little pop-up that will say, do you want to lean this direction or that direction? Can you give me more information about this or that? So that's my current recommendation for what it's worth. A little bit on AI responsibility. One is there's a great organization called Equal AI. It is mostly, and I know this is tiny to read, but you can get it on their website. It's mostly for people that are building AI chatbots or AI agents to do work. But it is also helpful if you are creating policies around AI. And its whole uh, reason for existing, Equal AI's reason for existing, is because if we are all the ones that are training these models and we know we all have bias, then guess what? These models have bias. These AI software have bias as well. So beware of that. One way to make sure that you are combating that is making sure it's called human in the loop. Um, Before I came back to Red Wiggler this last time, I was working for a health tech startup, and this is a very buzzy tech word, but it basically means that you're not letting AI do anything without checking it or being involved. And I think that's really important for grant writing because one, you don't want to just be making up statistics. You don't want it creating a program that you have no infrastructure or capacity to carry out. So making sure there's a human in the loop, really paying attention to privacy and coming up with policies for that. You have a little bit more protection with a paid account than a free account, but privacy is certainly still an issue. Thinking about transparency, finding out from funders how they feel about you using AI. in my experience, they are very pro using AI, but I don't think that's universal. But for the most part, when I've asked, hey, what's your feeling on using AI? People want to see us using our time wisely, and they know that AI can help us be more efficient. Now, there are some questions on, I've started to see it, did you use AI to write this grant? You want to, one, make sure that if you did use it, that that's not going to be disqualifying, but that if you did use it, you are transparent about it. And so I think it's going to become more of a thing that we are going to need to ask funders whether it is okay or not to be using AI. And then there is this piece of environmental impact, and I don't want to minimize it. And I also, I was a child of the 90s who was taught that if I just pick up all of the litter at recess, that I would help stop global warming. And while I still think it's very important for everyone to pick up their trash, I also know that in the context of all of AI use, to just bring it back to AI, the amount that we all will be using it is a drop in the bucket, which is maybe not a, but in the scheme of things, it is small, and we are doing good work, and other people, other corporations, other industries are using AI to its fullest. And if nonprofits and care farms and social service agencies are not using it, we have the risk. We're raising the risk of not keeping up and not being able to engage. So making sure you have policies, making sure that you know how to use it effectively and not in a non-biased way is important. Um, Here's how to get the most out of AI. Start with your own content. So before I ever had AI write anything for me, I gave it, which this is, giving up some of my, proprietary, my, work product. But I loaded up with things that I had written so that it could know my voice, it could know about Red Wiggler. And so starting with your own content, giving it context. So in grant writing, that can be this is the grant that I'm applying for. Here are their focus. Here's their website. You can like load it up with information so that you're giving it as much context so that it doesn't start guessing. Because when it guesses, that's when you get into some problems. And then you must review and revise. These are some of the best use cases for generative AI. So brainstorming, when you're just like throwing spaghetti at a wall, let it do some of that work for you. Surfacing, one of my favorite things to do is saying, these are the three priorities from this funder. These are my programs. Which would you suggest, Claude, my AI friend, which would you suggest I focus on? It's also, you can just ask it, like, can you generate clarifying questions so that I can think it through? It's also great for refining when there's those dang word counts. When you've written like the best program description you've ever written for one grant, you're like, great, I now have this perfect thing. And then it's 5 characters less the next time around using AI to just shorten it. I will say sometimes you have to like say like you didn't quite get it. So again, double check because the word count can be a little tricky for it. Um, can also just strengthen your sort of transition between things. Great for organizing things. And this is like a meme on the internet of like some people are using AI to take a long paragraph or a long paper and create bullet points, and other people are using AI to take your bullet points and create long paragraphs. But it can do both very, very well. It can also reorganize. My mom uses AI for her grocery list, where she just does like her whole grocery list and then says organize by section. And then she has all her dairy together and all her, whatever aisle together. And then analysis. So this is making sure, and this is, you definitely want to have that human in the loop for the analysis, but analyzing data, checking, making sure that you can ask it like, did I clearly connect the need with my approach with what I'm asking for funding? It can review what you've written for that. And it really is all about the prompts. So AI responds to direction, not intention. It doesn't know how you're feeling. It doesn't know what you need. It's a really good practice for those of us that need to practice asking specifically for what we need. Um, so it responds to that direction. Prompts are how you add that context. It can shape both bias, but also your voice. And it really turns AI into a tool, not an author. So this is how a prompt formula that I really like. So you're like, this is the context. This is the grant that I'm writing. These are their priorities. I want to focus on my care farming program. Um, Take that context and answer this specific question that's within the grant. That's the task. Identify who the audience is. So the audience is, in this case, the grant, the funders that are reading it. And then what are your values? So that's where if your organization uses strengths-based language, if your organization, uses certain terms or has certain values, make sure you add that in, and that's going to get you a better output for what you are asking for. Um, Here are a few examples that can kind of show you this. And I will say I do not use this good of grammar anymore. Claude gets a whole stream of consciousness and really deals with it very well. But for a long time, I was even like putting please at the end of things because that's just how I work. And sometimes it's nice, but these are some examples. So I'll give you a second to read these. And again, you'll have context or time to read them later. We'll share out the deck, but being as specific as possible about what your ask is and adding the context. You'll see in all of this, I have a section to paste things in, like give it information and it will serve you better. Okay, I am rolling right through. Key takeaways. Because we didn't talk a lot about it, I mentioned it briefly, but like you gotta proofread your grants. I will say we just went through at Red Wiggler and CFN a process that we felt worked really well, where we had sort of a kickoff meeting where we talked about, okay, this is the focus of the grant. Kate then ran with it and did a chunk. Kate and Andrea split up what parts of the grant they were going to do. They each did it. Then Sarah did a first review, and then I did a final review. So I had not touched or thought about this grant in a couple of weeks. And I was able to come in with fresh eyes and look at it kind of at the last round to just say, like, hey, I don't think we connected the dots clearly here. Because whenever you're in something for too long, you sort of start to lose what you wrote 3 weeks ago. So finding a proofreader, Red Wiggler in the past has also used, we've paid people to do this, and it has been worthwhile, especially when you're just starting to get going, to really help to crystallize and clarify. Um, Making sure you're aligning with the funder's mission. Remember that generative AI creates drafts, not decisions. Centering people. What we do is so people-centered, making sure that you're telling the stories in addition to the numbers. I really do think that the people and systems are fundable. It's just a matter of how you position it, aligning the narrative and budget, distinguishing those outputs from outcomes, and don't forget about your attachments. It is I think I finally have learned my lesson to not wait to do attachments last, because there's always that one attachment that asks for something you've never been asked before that you have to create from scratch, like resumes or bios or a 3-year retrospective on something. So making sure you at least look at what the attachments are that you need. Usually their budget, your 990, your IRS tax determination, list of key staff, list of board members. But again, occasionally there's an oddball in there, and you don't want to be about to submit the grant and realize you still have 2 hours of work to do. So don't forget about those attachments. And that is that. So I will stop sharing and we can open the floor for questions.
Thank you, Kara.
Ah,
As Kara mentioned, yeah, we've been in heavy grant writing season at Red Wiggler and CFN, and I think that um, Not only is this a good reminder to me as somebody who does a lot of grant writing, but hopefully y'all are finding some real value in it. Sorry, I think my computer might have been a little bit lapsed. Anyone have any questions? You can throw them in chat. Can also, I think you should be able to unmute yourself if you wanted to just ask a direct question. Kara, I've got one for you. Just on
Yeah.
some of the grant terminology, you mentioned in-kind or matching contributions. Can you just really quickly give an example of what those
Yeah,
might be?
absolutely. So in kind is usually, but not always, usually someone who is donating their time and services. So if you are a great example that Red Wiggler is we need new raised beds for our education garden. We have a carpenter who is donating his time in kind, and what we're raising money for are the supplies. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes, in this case, like Lowe's or Home Depot could be donating in kind the materials, and we
Mhm.
would be fundraising to pay for the person to build it. So in kind is basically a service or product that you are not directly paying for that's donated to you, and it is really helpful to emphasize that. So if you have volunteers, all of your volunteer is in-kind donations. And then matching is any funder, whether that's an individual or a foundation, who says, I'll give you $10,000 if you raise $10,000 from other people. Um, it's a great way. I will sometimes ask a funder, hey, can we use your contribution as a matching donation? Even if they've already committed, they get extra exposure. We say we have a matching donation from Kate Mudge, and she, runs the local shop, and everyone then knows about Kate Mudge's local shop, and we get, hopefully, we're leveraging that money to get sort of double what we would have otherwise. NPR is great at the matching. If you've ever listened
Yes.
to a to a membership drive, you know about matching donations. What are some
Okay.
places we've looked for grants? Yeah, so I have found it helpful to pay for a subscription to, let's see, we most recently used, it was Chronicle for Philanthropy, right, Kate?
Chronicles of
Um,
Philanthropy. Yep.
that's a great way to just pay for it once. I will say that if you have any local nonprofit, support organizations. Some of them will have access to some things like Foundation Source. I can send a list over. I'm blanking on. There's plenty of them. Candid, um, Foundation Source, and Chronicle for Philanthropy are the three that come to mind right now. Um, and sometimes actually local libraries will also have access, so you don't have to pay out of pocket. But I have found that to be helpful. Another great way is to look at other organizations that are doing similar work to you. Look at their 990, and they will list who funded them, and then that will you can then look into those funders. And then locally, I mean, we're in the DC area, which so we are fortunate to have a lot of philanthropy happening. And there are various listservs that both Montgomery County and DC will send out with grants. So definitely look into those resources locally as well. And I do pay for a subscription for Claude. It's something that I'm pricing out now organizationally. Just like a little, I'm struggling with if we're creating efficiencies, I want it to be so that our staff has better work-life balance and not so that we are burning ourselves out. It is definitely a risk with AI that if we just add AI, we're just all expected to do more. So I'm towing the line of efficiency. But yes, I pay for it. And I did move over semi-successfully my like history with ChatGPT from Claude. And there's a prompt that you can use. You can ask ChatGPT or Claude, what prompt should I use in the other one to get the information you need to know? And then you can like correct it. Another thing that I do that I forgot to mention is that, if it writes me something and then I tweak it and I edit it, I then send it back to, I'll say, this is what I ended up with so that it learns me better. And then I have to do less editing. I will say this last grant that I wrote this week, I did not have to make nearly as many edits as I did just a couple of weeks ago with Claude because I have been using it and trying to actively teach it what I like and don't like and how I write and how I sound and the words that I like to use.
I was going to also just chime into one of Julie's questions there around if you're just in those early stages of trying to establish a care farm. And if in that case, it was the qualitative data that she was looking for, like what quote. Um, I just want to encourage everyone to lean on CFN's website. Excuse me. There's a number of gosh, there's videos that, like, if you have the ability or you're allowed in a grant to share a link, we have things like a video that explains what care farming is. We have some things that you can download that shows the benefits of care farming, and lots of other articles and things that you can find in the resource library. And so, anytime that you can borrow those resources from somebody else, or point to them, like Kara had mentioned. We are a national initiative here that is gathering lots of good information, and including research. So again, the importance of knowing your community, who you're serving, and what that looks like. But there is research out there that kind of validates care farming in general. And you can grab some quotes and look a little fancy if you are citing that, Reese care farming has proven to do X, Y, or Z for certain populations. So, and in our resource library, we have an entire section on research, I'm sorry.
Don,
Let's,
is this a question? Where do those for Red Wiggler specifically about where our folks come from?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so we partner with a few social service agencies, and then we also local schools, and they bring out their students that are part of transition programs. So kind of various community referrals. Um, and yeah, how do you balance between how much effort you put on donor relations and grant writing? This is a great question that I have still figuring out. I think so. A few things for grant writing. This is where, again, looking at the 990 is really helpful. If it's a foundation, so like let's say a $5,000 grant, Red Wiggler's budget all in is about between 1.3 and 1.4 million. We need every penny. And so I am certainly not going to look away from a $5,000 grant. But it has to be really well aligned. I have to feel like we have a good chance of getting it because sometimes those $5,000 grants, the effort that they take is more or the same as a $50,000 grant. So part of it is like really looking at how much effort it's going to take, what the potential outcome is, how many grants they actually give out. So again, if it's a $5,000 grant and they give to three people, three organizations a year, I'm probably just going to say that's not worth my time unless it's a simple Google form that I'm submitting. So that's a lot of how I'm playing. I do rank all of the grants that when I'm doing research with a high, medium, low probability. And so if I'm super overwhelmed with work and I have a grant deadline approaching, that's a low probability. I'll just decide, it's not a priority right now. I have other things going on. In terms of the mix of like donor relationships of individual donors and all of that, I have been, this is brand new, so I'll let you know how it's going, but I'm trying to set myself up kind of seasonally, because it feels like that works with the rhythm of what we do to have just like different seasons of focus. So right now we are very much in grants focus because there were just, when I looked at the calendar, I was like, okay, there's a ton of deadlines right now, but as soon as May hits, the farm becomes more alive, and that's when I'm going to focus more on local individual donors. Um, and yeah, thanks for putting that in there, Kate. We do use Monday.com. There's a grants template that we have found pretty useful. I don't think I'm ready to give it like a full endorsement, but it's working much better than just a straight spreadsheet, I will say. Um,
One other thing just to note in there about that balance too, and this didn't come up too much, but the most grants are going to require a final report or a progress report. So keep that in mind. Once the money comes, that's great, but there can be sometimes some significant work involved to make sure that you are tracking what you said you would track and reporting back in a fashion that is feels good for the funder. So just kind of thinking about maybe uh, your ability to do all of that work after receiving a grant award. We are coming to the end of the hour here. Kara, thank you
Thank you
for
all.
another session, which was super helpful. As already said, we are going to be sharing out this recording as well as the slides, so expect them in your inbox there, certainly by next week. We are doing one more webinar that is a repeat from the conference, and that's coming up on April 30th. And the focus on that one is building a coalition with community partnerships. So you can go ahead and look on our events page on our website if you are interested in attending that. Um, would love to see you there. Thanks everyone for your time. Good luck in grant writing. We are here to help in whatever ways we can, and hoping that today was one of those ways. So everyone take good care, and thanks again.